Here are the different kind of maps that we discussed in this volume. Some maps can be used pretty much directly as rendered, such as the normal map. But other maps are going to be used in conjunction with other maps to create certain effects. I'm able to derive most of what I need for texturing from these few maps. Depending on what kind of shaders you have access to and the target art direction, you may not need all of these maps, or you may need some more. However, these are probably the most common ones, and once you become familiar with these, then it should be pretty easy for you to pick up other kinds of maps. You should get into the habit of thinking of your maps as resources to help you create the effects that you need. It's always safer to derive critical details from accurate sources, such as a baked map, so that you're guaranteed that everything will line up. Later on in the texturing stages, I can paint the diffuse texture more freely because I'm confident that the foundation that the ambient occlusion and cavity maps provide is in sync with the normal map, and this is a critical part of getting clean results. Once you develop a process that you like, it's easy to replicate your results onto other textures. This will help you produce additional models that look consistent and in an efficient manner. There are a few other maps that we will generate ourselves during the texturing stage. Things like specular, gloss, and emissive, but that will be covered in the next volume. For now, let's take a closer look at these maps, why we need them, and how to make them. I like to render normal maps first because it gives me a good idea of how successful I'll be when rendering the other maps. If I'm not able to get a good normal map yet, then going through with the other maps is almost pointless. Remember that your goal when baking normal maps is to try and reproduce the look of the high poly model as closely as you can. At game viewing distance, your normal map model should be virtually indistinguishable from the high resolution model. I feel like I need to say this because I often see beginners settle for normal maps that are plagued with errors, but they just accept the result because it looks bumpy and detailed. Most people think of normal maps only as a way to create more detail, but just as important is its ability to smooth out and create clean shapes that would be impossible with the crude normals of a low polygon model alone. In this example here, I have a high polygon model and a low polygon model, and you can see that the shading on the low polygon model on this curved surface, you can see how the light is showing up stronger on the edges, the polygonal edges. So it creates a sort of faceted and soft look that isn't as smooth as this one, the high polygon model. If I turn on the normal map, then you can see that a lot of those problems goes away. I mean, obviously the normal map here is creating the beveled edge as well. That's what I consider to be more of the detail part of it, and then it's smoothing out these shapes in here. The normal map is one of the most crucial maps to get right because it's responsible for providing most of the visual contrast on the model under normal lighting conditions. Even here where there isn't really light, you can see that a lot of the lightest and darkest values on this model are being provided through the normal map. If I turn off the normal map, you can see that there's nothing there. There's no great value difference, which is what the human eye needs in order to differentiate shapes like that. In most current generation of games, I'd say that the normal map is just as important, if not more so, than the diffuse texture, which is what a lot of people typically think of when referring to a game model's texture. I say this because if you have a good normal map, then a good normal map and a good lighting and rendering engine, the diffuse texture can be almost anything without it breaking the illusion of the shapes. The strong values here created by the lit and shadow surfaces will still be accurate even if you screw up on your textures. However, if you had the opposite situation where the normal map had a lot of problems in it, then there's only so much you can do with the diffuse texture to try to fix those. I try to preview my bake results as soon as I can, especially with normal maps. Sometimes the problems that you may have in the bake aren't really apparent until you put the normal map onto the model. If you aren't familiar with how to preview in Maya, let me give a quick rundown. On the low polygon model here, this is the material that I have on it, Lambert 6. You should really name your materials more descriptively than that. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect this normal map. So pretend that this is a newly made material. If you go to checker box on bump mapping, you want it to go to 2D textures, click file texture. Under 2D bump attributes, under use as, you want to change that to tangent space normals. Under bump value, go there and browse for the normal map, pauldron.targa in this case. And there you go. Then you have to just make sure that you have high quality rendering mode on, either through that button there or under render, just choose high quality rendering or viewport 2.0, whichever you prefer. One other thing I wanted to mention about previewing normal maps in Maya. If you select your model and you go to the shape node, you'll find that there's a tangent space rollout here. And by default, Maya uses right-handed for the coordinate system. If you switch it to left-handed, you can see that in my case it screws up the normal map. But there are some times when this will actually look correct for you, and that's related to the orientation of the green channel of the normal map. And to demonstrate that, let's go to Photoshop real quick. We'll keep it on left-handed here. So if I switch to Photoshop, this is the normal map. You can see that if you go to the green channel here, that the light appears to be coming from the top and the shadow is on the bottom here. If I just press Ctrl I in Photoshop to invert this one channel, and it'll only change this one channel, I won't change the other ones. You can see I flipped it. And then if I save this texture now, and I go back to Maya, and go to the texture and reload it, you can see that now it looks correct on left-handed, but it doesn't look correct on right-handed. So depending on the game engine, it'll use different coordinates for that, or it'll use either y positive or y negative. If I switch over to XNormal really quickly and take a look at the rendering options for normal map, you can see that here they refer to it as swizzling the coordinates. And by default in XNormal it's also y positive, but you can change it to y negative, and then what it'll do is it would render the normal map as you saw here. If we go back to the RGB. So this is what it was by default, and this is with the green channel inverted. And normally I leave it on y positive for my personal work, but I worked on projects in the past where it used y negative, and that would just depend on whatever game engine you're working with. Most engines, I believe, use either y positive or y negative. I have yet to come across one that uses anything different for the X and Z, but I'm sure it's out there somewhere. So just keep in mind that's how you would handle this kind of situation. And it's perfectly fine to just um, invert the channel here. You don't have to actually go back and re-render the normal map because you had it on the wrong coordinate system for the tangent space. One more example of how a normal map is actually working is if you replaced it with the neutral normal map color. I have the same scene here. Here's the low polygon model with the normal map, and what I will do is jump to Photoshop, and I'm going to fill it with this color. And this color is 240 in hue, 50% in saturation, and 100% in brightness. You could also remember it by the RGB values, which is 128 in red, 128 in green, and 255 in blue. So basically 50% red, 50% green, and 100% blue. And it's actually pretty important to remember these numbers, and it makes sense. It's pretty easy to remember. There isn't really an excuse not to know. So I'm going to save this, jump back to Maya, and if I reload this texture, you can see that it now resembles this model, which does not have a normal map connected at all. This illustrates how the colors you see in a normal map really work to create the appearance of another surface. And it's going to be important to understand this when we start to talk about manually editing normal maps a little bit later on. One additional thing I wanted to mention about normal maps is if you've ever examined the normal maps from some games, you may notice that they don't always look like conventional normal maps. Sometimes they have odd colors, or they look like they have a detail scrambled with another texture, or something like that. What is happening here is that they are probably using the blue channel for another kind of map. And this is possible because the way normal maps work is that all of the tangents have to equal 1. And if you already know 2 of the 3 values, then figuring out that third one is pretty easy. And in this case, that's what we have here. If you already know the red and green, then the game engine can figure out the blue channel on its own. So with that said, you could replace it like I have here with another map. It could be a mask, or it could be it could be any number of things depending on what your shader or how your shader is set up. And I also included an alpha channel here just for fun. This is why some shaders allow you to replace the blue channel with something else that's totally unrelated to the normal map. Other ways to combine maps include having a texture sample where each of the red, green, blue, and even alpha channels are used to store different kinds of black and white maps instead of using all of those channels to create a single color map. And so here's an example of that, where I have this image here. What I would do in this case is I would make layer groups, and I have red, green, and blue. You can see inside is all it is just a layer with just white painted for R, in this case green, a G for green, and B for blue. And what I would do here is I would work in a separate file. This would be my Photoshop source file. And what I would do is you'd only do one layer at a time, have one layer visible at a time. I would select everything. If you press Ctrl-Shift-C, then it'll copy, it'll basically flatten the entire canvas and make a copy of that. And I'll go to my red channel here and paste it in there. And you can see what happens if you go back to RGB, what the end result is going to be like. And don't worry too much about that right now. But I'm going to do the same thing. Go to green, Control-Shift-C, Go to green here, Control V paste, blue, there. And now if you go back to RGB, you can see the end result. And I mean, this looks legible here, but if you had three completely different kinds of maps going on, sometimes the result can be very visually confusing, and it's not going to look like anything to you, but that's fine, because what the game engine is going to do is it's going to break it down to these components. Sometimes you even have situations where there will be multiple maps stored in the same channel, and they're differentiated by giving each of the maps dominance in certain value ranges. For example, you could have a situation where you combine your specular and your gloss into one map, essentially. And the way that would work is, maybe values from 0 to 128 would be more biased towards specular, and then or 127, and then 128 up to 255 would be more biased towards gloss. Or you could have something where you could just paint specular with the full range, and then it would automatically scale the gloss based on how bright and shiny it is. That's just another of many ways you can compromise how to set up your shader, and that's kind of getting outside of the scope of this tutorial series, but I just wanted to give some examples of how you can expect to find the way these things work in production